Today's topic is about sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is an inherited trait or disease which can pass from generation to generation. That can turn healthy red cells or red blood cells, they look like donut shape and they are red, into abnormal sickle-shaped red cells, meaning sickle-shaped red blood cells. And they have a kind of sickle-like shape, which can cause first is artery and vein blockage, tissue infections, pain in where it blocks, among other problems. And the first question you will say is, but what causes sickle cell anemia? So now I will tell you. 1. Synthesis of hemoglobins. Nucleus of an electroblast at chromosomes 11, that's where the mutation and makes sickle cell anemia. This is the DNA, and the green stuff you're seeing now is the mutation in the beta globin gene. Beta globin gene is responsible for the beta globin. So, with the mutation, you'll have sickle cell anemia. And DNA polymerase makes the copy a messenger RNA, a part of DNA. And the part of the RNA the DNA polymerase makes is with the mutation, and it sometimes won't work properly, of course. Then the mRNA goes out of the nucleus to the cytosol. Then the ribosome translates the mRNA bases and make BS globin, mean beta globin. Beta S globin means a genetic mutation in the beta globin gene, which causes them to have make them a huge connection when hemoglobin fully formed. The formation of dimetric BS globin is from the chemical bonds that they have with each other. They can only stick with one BS globin can stick with one A globin or another BS globin. And they're having an A globin is from the chromosome 16. And when two of them get together, they make a formation of a tetrametric ABS globins. So there's free iron flowing around, and all of the globins have a heme group, so they can make a bond with it with an ionic bond. And when that happens, make a formation of HBS molecule. So the next question you're gonna say is, How does sickling occur? So it's chapter 2. How does sickling occur? Healthy hemoglobin molecule, HbA, have a tiny connection when they are all together. This is when oxygenation, which means all of them have ionic bond to oxygen. This is deoxygenation, meaning that it removes oxygen out of its ionic bond. This is oxygenation, which is HBS. And deoxygenation, the exposed connection. Connection is long enough to stick with other HBS molecules. So, deoxy-HbA means healthy hemoglobin, which are their connections are too small to stick together. And that's when they're close enough to make an ionic bond. This is polymerization of deoxy-HbS. Means they have an ionic bond that makes them stick together. One is partially positive and the other is partially negative. The sickling happens when the polymer of HbS modify the red cell structure, then make it fragile, less flexible, and shortening its life. Fragile because the longer the polymers are, the more fragile it becomes. When it happens, some hemoglobin will break the membrane, expose everything out. Just left the hemoglobins intact, but left the red blood cell mixed to keep in burst. Less flexible means that from arteries and veins, it can't go through, so they get stuck. Also shortening its life because they have pointy spots on the hemoglobins, on the mutated hemoglobins. And giving it the shape which is typical to sickle anemia. Oxygen, Chapter 3, Oxygen Functional Imbalance and the Changes in the Red Blood Cell Membrane. The HbS polymerization prevents the use of oxygen by the hemoglobin. Then, there's enough space to make free oxygen into molecular oxygen. Molecular, in the term of atoms, means two. Molecular oxygen as a stable diradical. Diradical means two free radical forms. And the trouble begins when the free electrons are incorporated by the oxygen molecule, because oxygen is super electronegative. So electrons could get near it and been pushed inside it. And it turns into activated species of molecular oxygen superoxide anion. Superoxide anion attack the membrane. And when that happens, it destructs the fatty acids of the membrane. And the holes that you see are membrane lesions, which the superoxide anion break. The activated oxygen also oxidizes HbS molecule, turning it into meta-HbS, which much more connections. meta-HBN molecules get together, forming hen's bodies. Precipitation of hen's bodies go towards the membrane through the band 3 protein and also makes the membrane much more less flexible, because the hen's bodies have stiffened it up, and it can grow, make bacteria a great place to live in, or also some viruses. But they're gonna have a hard time going through. And I said before, a sickle cell trait means half of their body is sickle cell anemia, half the other is not, but it's random. So part of their body has the most sickle cells and the other has less. Malaria, a kind of virus which mostly in mosquitoes use red blood cells as it movement to go through the bloodstream. So they have enough red blood cells. So here, malaria always hijacks red blood cells to make itself through the bloodstream. So the people in Africa, lots of mosquitoes who have sometimes 75% of the world who always have sickle cell anemia had the sickle cell trait too. So most people in that region will also much more malaria. So there are enough sickle cell for the malaria virus to have a hard time, and they're more resistant to malaria. They also get the symptoms, but it's not severe as normal person does. But there's some people with sickle cell anemia who got malaria. It didn't even have symptoms. They only got some pain from all of that sickling and also the clogged veins and arteries. Chapter 4, Sickling Consequences. First, sickle cells can block the arteries and veins. Like I said before, can cause vascular swelling because of all the blood cells that have been stuck there, which causes tissue swelling and pain in the hands and feet. Mostly in the hands and feet, but not much. The sickle cells are phagocyted or by macrophages, and this contributes to anemia. Anemia means the skin whitens because the lack of oxygen. So when the macrophages eats phagocyted some of the sickle red cells, they release cytokines that diffuse into the microvessels of the central nervous system, sending signals that can cause, first, vasculoconstriction, increased heart rate and blood pressure, metabolic disturbances, fever, and pain. That's the end of the video. Goodbye.